Hello.
Hey.
Hey, y'all.
How's it going?
Good. Adria.
Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Excellent.
Hello, everybody.
Hey, Jesse.
Hi. How's it going?
Hello.
Hey, Andy.
Jesse, how you doing?
Pretty good, pretty good.
Good.
Very enjoyable today.
Yeah. I just wish the breaks were a little bit longer. I've been nonstop.
I didn't go to the last one so that I could eat lunch.
I haven't had that chance yet. I chaired 2 sessions, then I've been the first, second, and this is my 3rd presentation. So I haven't had a break since 8:15 this morning. I run to go to the bathroom, run back to my computer. So. But yeah, but it's been great. It's been really cool seeing everybody. This platform works well.
Yeah, I like it.
I'm attending 2 virtual conferences in the same day.
Wow.
There's the Education Law Association is meeting yesterday and today, and they're using a platform called Whoova.
Okay.
I much prefer Hopin.
Whoova is what the state science teaching organization is using. We used it last year too. It's okay.
And in their defense, like that's a hybrid conference. Like half the people are in the room and half the people are virtual.
Oh.
And it's really hard to do that well.
Yeah.
Even like panelists, like there's a panel of 4 people and 2 people are in the room and 2 people are virtual, and it's complicated.
You need a lot of event technology or like physical space technology to make that work.
Yeah. And people kind of monitoring chats and stuff. And,
yeah. Well, we've got the Academic Learning Commons scheduled for next year already for this conference. So
excellent.
Maybe we'll be back in person.
Maybe we will be.
Yes, gotta wish it into existence.
Yeah. So when we do this, I'm going to present my slides, but the thing I've realized about presenting slides in Hopin is that I can't see anything. All of a sudden, my screen is taken over by my presentation, and so I'm blind to the chat, and I can't mute myself. I don't have access to my control buttons. So anyway, there's some parts in the presentation where I reference the chat, and maybe somebody could be there to kind of like read out some of the things, like when people say stuff in the chat, like could respond, because I'm not gonna be able to see it.
Yeah, I'll keep an eye on that, Jesse. I think it's one of my jobs.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. All right, I got 150. Are we ready?
What are we doing on people?
Let me see. $23.
23. Oh, that's not bad. That's not bad.
I wanted to play the Clash song, "Should I Stay or Should I Go?"
Why don't you just sing it?
Well, I actually had it all queued up. You don't want me to sing it, I promise you that. All right, well, team, we all ready?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Well, everyone is joining us here for session 13. Welcome. It is my pleasure to introduce the team and help moderate the chat and keep us all on time today. This is Will They Stay or Will They Go? Lessons learned from the MERC Teacher Retention Study, which is a a very opportune time, perhaps more so than any point in history, for us to revisit the teacher retention study right now, as a lot of us know here on the call. Our panelists today represent the MERC Teacher Retention Team. And that includes Jesse Senechal, who's the director of MERC, and he has led a wide range of applied research and evaluation projects in close collaboration with Richmond area school divisions, nonprofits, higher ed, and state agencies. Kasey is a doctoral student in the special ed department at VCU, and her research interests include special education teachers' relationships with their colleagues and administrators' preparation and knowledge of special education law, and how these factors connect to special educators' job satisfaction and retention. Valerie Robnolt is an associate professor in the Department of Teaching and Learning in the School of Education at VCU and serves as the reading program coordinator and teaches pre-service and in-service teachers methods of teaching literacy and language arts. Elizabeth Edmondson is a principal investigator for VISTA at VCU in the Department of Teaching and Learning and has a very broad background in science education, I noticed in your CV, Elizabeth. So here. Erica Ross is a third-year PhD student at VCU in the Research Assessment and Evaluation track, and her research interests include teacher retention, special education, social networks. Adria Hoffman serves as the Anna Lou Schauberg Professor of Practice at VCU and is the current president of the Virginia Association of Colleges and Teacher Educators, and her work focuses on teacher preparation, induction, and retention. And John Becker is an associate professor of educational leadership and teaches courses in school law, the politics of education, and his research interests lie at the intersection of technology and educational policy. I'm Andy Armstrong. I'm the Assistant Superintendent of Administration in Goochland County Public Schools and have enjoyed working with MERC in several projects over the years and look forward to hearing the presentation today. So, Dr. Senechal, I will give the keys over to you.
All right. Thank you. So I'm going to project some slides. And I think I was telling folks earlier, I'm going to be driving blind, so I'm not able to see the chat or anything like that. Just to my co-presenters here, one is, keep an eye on the chat. And the other is I created a list of links to post in the chat related to some of the stuff we're talking about. So if somebody can kind of be in charge of like throwing some of that stuff in the chat, that'd be great. All right. So here we go. And wait, view. All right, here we are at the MERC conference, and these are the folks that were just introduced by Andy. And so we know who is here. I thought we'd start off a little chat because we want to get a good chat going. I think the sessions are better when they have a good chat going. Your name, your role, your affiliation, district, school, university, and your favorite teacher. Who was your favorite teacher? And for me, that would be Bridget Newberry, who was an art teacher and actually still is an art teacher at Open High School in Richmond, Virginia. She was my high school art teacher and really made me think differently about the world. So if you could put that in, that'd be great. All right, and as you're doing that, I'm going to move ahead to the next slide. So this is a MERC study, which means it was a study commissioned by the MERC Policy and Planning Council, which is made up of leaders from the different school divisions and folks from VCU. It was identified a few years ago. And, one thing we do when we put together a MERC study is we have a team of the VCU team, which includes, faculty from the School of Education mostly, although we have one faculty member from Bowdoin College who's joined our team, as well as graduate students. And so we've got a really all-star team here working on this project, bringing a lot of different perspectives around teachers and teachers' work to the table. And then in addition to that, one of the things that we really believe is that our work is better when we engage the voices of the district folks, and that includes both central office perspectives and school level perspectives. I think there's a really nice exchange of ideas when you have faculty who generally exist in the world of research and generalized knowledge, working with people that are really bound by, the context and systems they work, and they bring different insights into questions that we ask. And so this is these are some of the people that have worked on or are working on the project, have been there at meetings along the way, have looked at data with us, things like that. So here's the outline of what we're going to do today. Unlike some of the other sessions, this just is one presentation about this study, although within it, we're going to have a bunch of mini presentations, what we're calling burst sessions. And the idea of the burst is that it's 5 minutes long. And if we wanted to be really tough about it, we would probably have a timer and cut you off when you went over 5 minutes. But maybe we'll give you a little bit of leeway on that anyway. But I'm going to start by giving a little background on the teacher retention study real quick. And then we're going to go through a series of bursts, 5 of them. And each of these is going to be talking about a different component of the larger teacher retention study that we're doing. And then we're going to end with hopefully a good chunk of time, if these bursts don't go too long. I don't think they will, but we'll have a good chunk of time at the end to look at themes across the projects, and have a little discussion around teacher retention, because as Andy mentioned, now is a time when we really need to be thinking about the experiences teachers are having of their work and how we hold on to a engaged and effective workforce. So background on the teacher retention study. Interestingly, this study came after a prior study that was commissioned by MERC. Probably around 2014, there was a call to do a study of teacher morale. And that was one of the first MERC projects that I worked on when I came on board with MERC, and led this project. And this was a qualitative case study. We looked at 3 middle schools across the region, and interviewed over 40 participants, I think 44 participants, that included mostly teachers, but also some administrators, and tried to understand what the drivers of teacher morale were. And that report was published in 2016. And then soon after, in 2018, the Policy and Planning Council commissioned a study of teacher retention, seeing that, there's a lot of work that needs to be done here, knowing that teachers are so important. The teachers are the key to the success of schools. They're the ones that are delivering instruction and enacting education on a day-to-day basis. And so how do we make teachers stay was the question. What are the drivers of both attrition and retention? And these were the goals that we set out for the study from the beginning. We wanted to understand the factors underlying patterns of teacher retention in the MERC region, support the development of district data practices that will allow for tracking teacher retention, understanding the factors driving it, to conduct an evaluation of current state and local policies focused on teacher retention to determine impact and cost benefit, and to build a regional community of educational researchers and school leaders with some expertise in this area. And as you can see, we've got a big team that has been engaged in this project over the years, and I think there's a real community developing around VCU that has emerging expertise in this area, and I think it's going to be useful as we continue to tackle this problem. And the study components, so that those were the goals, and how do we go about meeting those goals? Well, there's several components here. One is we did an analysis and are doing an analysis of the Virginia Department of Education Working Conditions Survey, which was first administered in 2019, was administered again this year, and will be administered, I think, biannually moving forward. And so we got access to that data and we're able to analyze it, and we'll be sharing some of that today. Teacher exit survey. Over the past couple years, we've led exit survey work for many of the school divisions. This is about like the point around improving teachers, our district data practices. A lot of divisions had some sort of exit survey process or interview process, but they didn't have great response rates, and the data wasn't always used as much as it should be. And so we developed a common survey, exit survey, through sort of a rigorous review process of existing exit surveys. And now it's being used by a number of the school districts. So that's really exciting. And we're continuing to do that work. There is a current cost benefit analysis of teacher induction programs going on right now. We also have, and that'll be coming out soon, looking at, whether these are, that's an effective strategy for retaining especially those early career teachers. There's a teacher retention policy analysis. You'll be hearing a little bit about that today. Looking at policies, how policies are related to teacher retention are enacted across the region and what recommendations we have related to that. We also got access to Virginia Department of Education state retention data longitudinally, I think it goes all the way back to 2005. We're going to be sharing some of that today from 2008 to 2018, this 10-year period, and kind of looking at what are the patterns and trends in teacher retention. And then we're also doing some work on professional development modules for school leaders based on our research work. And we'll be talking a little bit about, actually, I'll be sharing a little bit about that during the presentation today too. So, okay, so we're going to jump into the burst in a second, but before we do, another in the chat request. So here's a question for you all, and I'm kind of curious about the collective wisdom of this group. Across the region, in a given year, what percentage of teachers stay at their current school? What do you think an estimate of that would be? Like, what percent of teachers stay at their school in any given year? So I can't see the chat, but are there numbers popping up?
Jesse, I'll give you some numbers here. We got some guesses: 72%, 80, 70.
Okay.
70.
Okay. 70s and 80s.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Those are pretty good guesses. Here's actually a chart that gives us some ideas. This goes back from 2008 to 2018. That's where our data set stopped. Although I'm really interested in looking at the years after this, 19, 20, 21. And these are percentage of stayers, school level stayers, 2008 through 2018. And you can see in 2018, the most recent year we have data for, it's just below 80%, which means basically if there were 5 teachers, 4 of them stayed and 1 left. When you think about there being 100, if there were 100 teachers at a school, 20 of them leave every year. So what are your thoughts about this? And what else do you think about, what other questions arise from just looking at this graph? Any thoughts you want to share in the chat? Again, I'm trying to get a chat going here. Anything you notice about this trend line that's interesting?
I'm waiting on some replies here, Jesse. I got you.
All right.
Interested in where they go. Is it because of a new career, family move, transfer within the division, difference by content and level? Just good factors, so many factors. What happens 2 to 3 years later? The difference the economy may have made.
Yeah. You can see the economy piece on the left side of this, where we all know the recession hit in 2008, and that was followed by a huge rise in retention. Interestingly, well, maybe not surprisingly, people were scared about losing their jobs, and so they decided not to move. But that was followed by a big dip. And so again, it'll be really interesting to see what's the effect of the pandemic. I think initially there was some concern about teachers leaving, and then those weren't fully realized. But now we're starting to see the maybe delayed effects of that, as there's a lot of concern about the mental health and well-being of teachers, and there are big concerns. You might have been following some of that in the news. There's a big Washington Post article about it. You saw the move that Richmond just made around taking a couple days off of school in the coming weeks to give teachers a break because they're really stressed right now. So so this is a portrait of some of what we're asking about in this study. We're trying to understand what these trends are about and how we can make this trend line go up, because we know that having more teachers stay, that the stability of the teacher workforce, research has shown, is tied with more sort of coherent professional communities and more engaged teachers, and more effective instruction and better student outcomes. There's research that I think supports all of those points. So we're going to jump into the burst now, and is the first burst presenter video working conditions. That's going to be Val and Kasey. Are you all ready to present?
Sure.
All right. Well, here we go. 5 minutes.
All right. Thank you so much, Jesse. Kasey and I are going to present on behalf of our team, which was John Becker, Erica Ross, and the two of us. And so we had the great opportunity to analyze data from the Vdoe Working Conditions Survey. And can you go to the next slide? And this survey was, as Jesse mentioned earlier, it was first administered in the spring of 2019, so pre-COVID. And to over 54,000 teachers in Virginia took the survey, and actually almost 1,700 schools represented in the sample. And so it was organized around these constructs of professionalism, teaching, instruction, and student support, school and community supports, and safety. And then within those constructs, you can see the scales. And so we really analyzed which of these scales were the most important for teachers deciding to either stay at their school or to leave their school. And so we're going to talk about those results in a minute. So Kasey's going to talk next about the stayers and leavers.
Right. So towards the end of the survey, teachers were asked about their immediate professional plans, and their answer choices were continue teaching at their current school, continue teaching in their division but leave their school, continue teaching in their state but leave their division, continue teaching in a state other than Virginia, continue working in education but pursue a non-teaching position, leave education to retire, leave education to work in a non-education field, or leave education for other reasons. So this graph shows the percentage of teachers in Virginia, and then in specifically the MERC divisions, who indicated their intention to stay at their current school. So the darker blue color represents the stayers, and the lighter blue color represents the movers and the leavers. For Virginia overall, 82.1% of teachers stated their intention to stay at their current school. And for the MERC divisions, 77.8% of teachers stated their intention to stay at their current school. So the difference was statistically significant. And research does indicate that within school factors strongly correlates to teacher retention decisions. Next slide, please. So then on this graph, we are specifically looking at the MERC divisions, and the light green color represents the stayers, the medium blue-green color represents the movers, and the dark blue-green color represents the leavers. So on the survey, a mover would have selected continue teaching in their division, but leave their current school, continue teaching in their state, but leave the division, or continue teaching in a state other than Virginia. So there is significant variation across all of the MERC divisions, and the percentages range from 62.5% in District 1 saying that they would stay at their current school to 88.9% of teachers in Division 7 saying that they plan to stay at their current school. And then some other findings that we found that related to teachers indicating their intent to stay that were significant were that Black or African American teachers were less likely to indicate an intent to stay at their school than any other racial group. Middle school teachers were less likely to indicate an intent to stay than any other school group. And teachers who had been at their school for 4 to 10 years were also less likely to indicate an intent to stay than any other range group. Next slide, please.
And what's interesting about when we did analyses of all the different constructs and scales is that our findings are really mirrored what the research has been showing for a number of years. And so as you can see, the strongest positive relationship with staying has to do with school leadership. And so this has been found in the research over and over again, how important school leadership is for teachers wanting to stay at their school and conversely wanting to leave their school. And the next most important of the scales was teacher autonomy and being able to, have more control over what they teach in their classrooms and just having more autonomy over the work that they do. And then finally, not finally, but the third most important scale was staff collegiality. So in all these sessions that I've been at today at the conference, there's been a lot of discussion about relationships and building relationships. And so this one shows that how important it is for for staff to have relationships with each other and for teachers wanting to stay. Also, safety was found to be one of the significant positive scales, and then academic environment. And then the ones that were negative relationship with staying were instructional practices and student behavior. And so, so these are just some insight into the issues that are keeping teachers at their schools and things that are causing them to want to leave their schools.
All right, burst 2. That was great.
Jesse, do we want them to put something in the chat first?
Sure. Yeah. And I kind of skipped over by accident, but if you have any questions during the sessions or ideas you have about the content, please post it. And then when we finish out these bursts, I want you to, we're going to have a discussion where we look at connections across the projects, thinking about how these projects connect to your current professional work. What are the implications of this for policy and practice? What other questions might this raise that we could research? And what are some things that we can implement or advocate for in our divisions and in our schools to support and move closer to the promise of teacher retention? I'm just going to put that out there. But if you have ideas for the chat from this presentation of the working condition survey, please post it now. And then we'll get going on John Becker's school principal and teacher retention first.
Okay, so yeah, as Jesse said, like we're going to do a little bit of research here where folks just put some thoughts from the last burst into the chat, and those will be data that we can compile at the end and kind of try and synthesize to see what are some themes across these different aspects of the teacher retention study. So, and I want a shout out to my co-investigator on this, Lauren Grobe, who couldn't be here today. Lauren is an undergraduate student at William & Mary, who has a real interest and passion for education policy and education policy research. And so she reached out to us, and she was an absolute delight to work with. And so she's my co-author on the brief that I'll be talking about today. Next slide, Jesse. So as Valerie said, the research on teacher retention has been quite clear over the years that the number one predictive factor for teacher retention is school leadership. Here's a quote that talks about how principals are kind of the chief human capital managers in their schools. And we hadn't really planned on doing any research specific to leadership. And so I suggested that we do kind of a little side review of the literature. And so that's what we did. Next slide. Specifically, we borrowed from this idea of kind of meta narrative. It wasn't a full kind of meta analysis, but we wanted to kind of tease out the meaning and significance of the literature. And specifically what we did is we saw that there were kind of a handful of studies that were kind of foundational and cited over and over again. And specifically, there were studies that used kind of large scale survey research techniques. And much like we did with the Vdoe working conditions survey, they used a scale of school leadership as predictive of teacher retention. And so what we did is we went to those studies, and then we found two that were a little bit more recent, so they hadn't had an opportunity to be cited as much. And so between those 6 studies, or across those 6 studies, we went and looked at the leadership scales to see what are the actual items in those scales. And it was sort of like working with Lego. We kind of deconstructed the scales into individual items, and then we were left with all these individual items or Lego pieces, and we wanted to kind of see what was in that pool of Lego pieces. And we kind of reconstructed it into a set of themes. So we took the items in the leadership scale to say, what about leadership is related to teacher retention? So next slide. Ultimately, we concluded that if you look across all of the items and all the scales in those 6 studies, you can see kind of 5 themes, and we call them the 5 roles for the principal. So these are the 5 roles that a principal needs to play if they're concerned about teacher retention. The first couple are not terribly surprising. They're the kind of things we talk about all the time in our leadership preparation programs, this idea of having a shared vision in the school, and instructional leadership, building community, providing professional development, leading curriculum creation. Those are fairly standard roles that we talk about when we talk about the work of a principal. That middle item there is based in work that folks have done in the last couple of decades around this idea of relational trust. Anthony Breich and Barbara Schneider have done a lot of good research on this. It's the idea of respect and competence and personal regard and integrity. And the more that a principal can kind of build those things and build that relational trust in a building, the more likely the teachers are to stick around. The last two are showing up a little bit more in recent research. This idea of principal as kind of being in charge of the safety of the school. Teachers are leaving to some degree because they have concerns around the safety of the building. And so it becomes important for principals to take on this role of being a safety officer. And then lastly, this idea of bureaucratic shield. So teachers reporting a lot of concerns over paperwork and dealing with bureaucratic measures that make it just hard for them to do their job. And so it's important for principals to take on that role. So from these roles, next slide, we suggest, and it's a little harder to see, but if you can see the report that Valerie linked to in the chat, we suggest, what can principals do? So, okay, I have to put on these 5 different hats as a principal so that I can retain my teachers. What can we actually do? And we suggest some potential action items. So, for example, as a safety officer, the principal can provide staff development focused on classroom management and practices such as restorative justice. Or if the principal wants to kind of put on their bureaucratic shield hat, they should think about developing and implementing systems and use technologies that allow everyone in the school to work smarter and not harder, so that they're not literally filling out paperwork and figuring out how to fax it over to the division office, that we have systems and processes in place that allow teachers to do the work that they really need to be doing and not having to deal with bureaucracies. So I hope that report is helpful. I feel pretty good about the work that we did to kind of break down these leadership skills, because it's one thing to say, as Valerie said in our research, that the leadership shows up as strongly predictive of teachers' intention to stay in their school. Well, what is it about leadership? What can leaders, principals in particular, what can they do to help teachers stick around? And that's what this report concludes. So that's the end of my burst. So feel free to kind of jot down some ideas about the role of the principal and teacher retention in the chat space.
Yeah, and I can't see, but I heard that Val posted the 2 reports in the chat. Check them both out. They're accessible through our website. And there's also a great podcast with a conversation with John and Lauren and Val and John Marshall, who's a principal in Henrico County at, I think, Douglas Freeman High School. So check those out if you're interested in that work.
Yeah. Good comment too, as we go into this next burst from Aaron, who just mentioned interest in seeing if there's any impact on principal retention in the coming years. And I will tell you that's, as these things trickle down, definitely something to keep an eye on.
Which is great, because that's the next topic of our burst: teacher retention and principal retention. And I'm going to pass it to Elizabeth and Erica to fill us in on this one.
Yes, thank you, Aaron. You're perfect timing, because one of the things as we were looking at some of this data was we realized that as principals shift within a building, how is that impacting whether teachers stayed? So there's a team of us, including Erica and Jesse and myself. And also I'd like to give a shout out to one of our data folks that's really helped us analyze this data. His name is Eric Ekholm. He's in Chesterfield. I noticed he was here earlier at the conference today, but he's really helped us look at a very large data set that comes from the Virginia Department of Ed, looking across these years of 2005 through 2018. And so as we were looking at whether teachers were staying, we realized we also needed to think about what the turnover of principals was. How long are they staying at a school? Is there a relationship between when the principals turn over and when the teachers leave, and those sorts of things? And then who then were the teachers that were leaving when they got a new principal? So we're going to share with you a couple of graphs just to kind of spark your interest in some of this data that's coming out that we're working with. So next slide, please. So here shows you sort of the average principal tenure, and this is across all Virginia schools. We had been working with just the MERC region, and we realized that we really sort of needed a bigger scale, or we wanted a bigger scale. And so you can see that there are 539 principals, or 539 schools where the principals have been there 3 years, and 406 or 4 years. When you kind of average all this out, what you see is that the average tenure for a principal is about 5 years. And we found quite a bit of ranges where, where there's a 1 year to many years in a school, and lots of factors impacting that. And we hope to try to look at some of that as well. But what's really interesting is to then consider what this turnover is doing to the teachers. And Erica is going to tell you a little bit about that data.
Next slide, please. Thank you. So we were also interested in how principal turnover is related to teacher turnover. So we wanted to see if do teachers tend to leave when a school has a new principal. So kind of mirroring the working conditions survey, we wanted to look at first what the average teacher retention rate in a school was just in general. And it was 81% in a given year. And when we ran our analysis, the average school with a new principal, the average retention rate for teachers is 79.18. So we were seeing a difference in that some schools do retain. So what was interesting about this is in the histogram is that we were seeing some variability in teacher retention rates across schools against the when they have the same principal, but some schools, they do have higher teacher retention rates when they do have a new principal, as we could see in the histogram, like on the right side. But it is skewed to the left, which would also indicate that the average here is slightly negative in that there's a slight decrease in teacher retention when there's a new principal. But the histogram illustrates that this certainly isn't the case for all schools. It's also just important to note, though, that this histogram is just the distribution of the data, so it's not taking any other explanatory variables into account. Next slide, please. So when we saw our histogram, we also wanted to look at some other variables as to what could offer some explanatory power in and looking at which teachers are leaving. So we highlighted in green teachers with these characteristics or demographics tended to have a higher odds of staying, and those in red are a lower odds of staying, and those that just aren't colored, those variables weren't found to be significant. So what we ended up finding is that teachers with either a postgraduate professional license or a provisional license are actually less likely to stay when there's a new principal. And this is compared to teachers with a collegiate professional license. And teachers with more years of experience are more likely to stay. And teachers who identify as an other gender or who did not indicate their gender are more likely to stay than female teachers. There was no difference, though, between male and female teachers. And teachers in high school are more likely to stay than teachers in elementary school, and that we found no difference between middle and elementary. Race does seem to play a role at both the teacher and student level. So we did include this variable as to the percent of the school population that was white. Within this analysis, we saw that white teachers do have a higher odds of staying than non-white teachers in years when there's a new principal, as well as the proportion of white students in a school is negatively associated with teacher retention. So after controlling for all these other factors, we saw that teachers in schools with higher proportions of white students are less likely to stay in years when there's a new principal. And that is it for the our principal and teacher retention analysis.
So we're getting little snapshots of these projects. If you have any questions that emerge from your look at the data, then please post them. And with that, we'll pass it on to Adria to talk to us about the teacher retention policy analysis.
So I am one of a large team. I definitely want to make sure I give credit where it's due. We've been led by Professor Andrine Castro. Also, John Becker has been on this team, David Knapp, and 2 doctoral students, Peter Willis and Andy Kane, who've contributed quite a bit to this project. So next slide. One of the big pieces that we immediately found was a conflation of what we tended to see as big P policies and little p policies that were better described as practices. So to make that distinction, a policy is very systems level. There's a specific strategy around it. There's program evaluation data collected and some sort of evidence of either impact or maybe evidence of or absence of evidence of impact, or maybe perhaps even unintended consequences. Practices, which here in Virginia were so much as site-based, was very much a site-based set of often well-intended practices described as school policies. They were varied, and they often didn't have any kind of systems level thinking or program evaluation. We also found that quite a bit of what we might call a policy in several school divisions, they didn't think of them particularly as retention policies. So it may have been a policy that had something to do with another piece of the large puzzle that is schooling, and it has an impact or it's a variable in teacher retention, but it wasn't thought of by central leadership as something that was part of a teacher retention big P policy. And so it was a little hard to detangle some of those things. So I wanted to lay that out first, is helping folks, helping ourselves understand the distinctions between site-based practices and strategic thinking, systems level thinking policies, and to really ask ourselves, are there opportunities to look more broadly across our schools and our school divisions and our region and say, what are the policies that are out there that aren't necessarily characterized as teacher retention policies, but play a major impact in teacher retention? Next slide. So there was a 3-dimensional teacher policy typology framework that we looked at. What I have up here on the screen is 2 of those levels, the school level and the division level, because that's where most of us that are attending this conference actually can make an impact. Those are the policy levers we can pull at our school levels and at our division levels. And across the top of this table, you'll see types of policies, economic incentives. So an example of a school level might be providing on-site childcare. That is an economic incentive. And I'll also just note, by the way, that Vdoe teacher retention and attrition surveys in the past have characterized childcare as a personal choice. It wasn't like a separate choice related to economic impact. So we may be missing some of those data statewide around why teachers choose to leave. And any of us who've been in the profession long enough know that oftentimes somebody who has the 3rd kid, for example, realizes that childcare costs more than their teacher salary. So that is an economic decision to stay or to leave. So that economic incentive can actually be providing on-site childcare at a school. At a division level, some of our divisions provide childcare subsidies and even transportation to other sites within the school division where kids can go before or after school while they are still under the contract. So that's a couple of highlights. Avenues into the profession was another aspect of this framework. So for instance, some of our MERC school divisions provide scholarships for graduating high school seniors to pursue teacher preparation programs. And in return, they may already have sort of an open offer that they're guaranteed a contract coming back to that school division after they graduate, or they may have other incentives. So it's a grow your own kind of incentive and avenue into the profession. Under hiring strategies, a couple of division level hiring strategies that we found to be very impactful are things like removing leave day transfer caps. So for instance, a teacher might be going from Division A to Division B or considering that move, and the cap on how many days they can transfer in is something that may impact their decision whether or not to stay where they are or come to a new division, particularly out of state or over state lines even. Another one is hiring effective teachers willing to become SPED endorsed, and then the division actually paying for their coursework. So it's both kind of a hiring strategy at the division level and also an avenue into a particular endorsement area. So many of our schools in the region often have special education positions posted, but may or may not have a high school English position. But if somebody is a really, really good match for that school and that division, maybe they've moved, maybe there's some other factor and they really want to teach in that division and they're willing to become SPED endorsed, for that division to say, you know what, this is also our critical need area. So we're going to help you. We're going to hire you on a provisional license, pay for your coursework, and help you get fully professionally licensed with that endorsement in special education is a really unique and creative hiring strategy. Under professional development, there might be things like establishing cohorts to pursue professional development opportunities, such as national board certification or leadership credentials. At a division level, there may be funding upfront costs to pursue those leadership credentials. So we've spoken to many teachers who've said, I would do this, but I don't have, or it doesn't make sense for me to front the costs. If somebody else was fronting those costs, then I might pursue this. And we know that, for example, national board certification actually leads to greater teacher retention. Another one is working conditions. So something that a building level leader could do is think about differentiated workload for novice teachers, such as teaching fewer preps or having fewer preps that have multiple co-teachers, where they would need to plan with, say, 3 or 4 different teachers versus just none or one. At the division level, it could be providing separate religious and bereavement leave days, separate from sick days. Another one under working conditions at the division level might be that workload again. And it may be something where a division could say, your instructional load is no more than 60% of your content or contract time. Next slide. So there's one missing P in our induction policy, so to speak. We know that having a carefully selected and trained mentor reduces the chances of a teacher exiting by 27 to 32%. And yet Virginia Code only requires a formal mentor assignment by a school division for the first year of employment. So if you look at, I took a screenshot of Luke Miller's data from the statewide Teacher Retention Summit just a few years ago, 3 years ago, and you could see that the pinch points, so to speak, where teachers are exiting the system are at years 3 and 5. Those are particularly critical years. So this idea of a missing policy lever saying we're going to assign a mentor, but only for year 1, but not as they move to year 3, or if they're provisionally licensed and they extend it out to year 5, that's a missing policy lever for us. And definitely want to encourage you all to think about what are the other puzzle pieces when we think about comprehensive teacher induction that might be a missing policy lever. So those are some of our highlights. There are many, many more, but in 5 minutes, I wanted to keep it to some of the highlights. So thank you all very much. Please feel free to put questions in the chat and I'll respond to them as I pass the baton to my colleagues.
All right, and then I'll finish us off with the last burst here. And this is a team that includes Val Robnolt, Elizabeth Edmondson, who are on this call, Katie Yeasley, who's also just joined our team, and we're going to be thinking about this. So these are a couple of reports that we just actually talked about earlier today. The school principal and teacher retention, will they stay where they go, the working conditions survey. But one of the things that we've been thinking about ever since we started, or that I started with MERC, and prior to that, is how do we really get research used by folks within school districts? We have this work that we're doing, which has obvious, as we've talked about, implications and recommendations for school leaders, especially. But how do we translate the research into practice? And with MERC, we do that through a number of ways. We publish things through scholarly journals, but we also do district-facing reports like this that are kind of made for that audience. We also have our podcasts, which you might know about. We do professional development presentations like at this conference. But we've been trying to think also about a new, this is an example of the podcast, a new format for research dissemination that would be straight into professional development modules. Because the idea is that we want to have folks take the research work we do, the findings that we come up with, and really reflect on it in active ways, and also reflect on it in relationship to their practice in ways that might influence their practice, that might lead to impact in the ways that they run a school, or interact in a classroom setting. And so what we've done is we're piloting this idea with modules from this study, mostly with data that we collected through a survey that we administered around teacher working conditions. There was the Vdoe one, but we also did a local MERC one. And these modules are each about 20 to 30 minutes long. They're going to be programmed. Right now, they're programmed into a survey program, but they kind of read like a Nearpod or like a series of slides with interactive components. They're based on, like I said, research work from our study. And they encourage engagement with research literature. So there are parts where we present ideas from the literature to kind of help them think, for example, what are teacher working conditions? So we present a definition from the literature of that. We also have them analyze data in the course of these modules. So they'll look at data, for example, some of the graphs that we showed. They might be presented that graph and asked to interpret that. And then also really think about the data in relationship to their practice. And what we're also working into these modules are the idea of extension research activity, so that after they complete a module, they'll then have ideas about how they might take what they've learned and do something within their school based on that. So we're really, again, trying to think about how we put this research information in a form that will really lead to changes. And I'm going to run you through an example module real quick, just to show you what we're talking about here. So these are slides from our second module around teacher morale, and this is the text that the person taking the module would see. And so it talks about a survey item that we included that defines job-related morale, as an anticipation of future job satisfaction, and then has the survey respondents rated the morale on a scale of 1 to 10. And we had like over 1,000 people respond to this. And based on these scores, we categorize the respondents into 3 levels: high morale, medium morale, and low morale teachers. And so then we have these parts in here where, like in the red italicized text, where we would have the people taking the module think about your school building. Are there low, medium, and high morale teachers at your school? And so then we give some data visualizations of the morale data. Okay, in the figure to the left, each dot represents a low, medium, or high morale teacher. And this is based on the results from a survey, this is an approximate distribution of teachers at the average morale school. So of all the schools, we had over 60 schools in this sample. The average school looks something like this, with 11 of the teachers being low morale, almost 40 of them being medium, and then the remainder 41 being high morale. And this is what the distribution looked at the highest morale school. And you can see there are no low morale teachers there, and they're mostly high, and then some medium morale teachers. And then this is the lowest morale school. And you can see that there are 25 low morale teachers at that school, and many fewer high morale teachers. And so we present this data, and then we ask the people taking the module, think about the school where you work. What would you say is the average morale? And there'll be a box for them to sort of type up their responses. And what are the challenges of working? What would be the challenges of working at a low morale school? So they look at this data and they might think, if I was at that lowest morale school, what would the challenges as an administrator be? And just to kind of reflect on that for a minute, maybe jot down ideas related to that. And then we put data in front of them, and on that survey that we administered, we also asked the question around immediate professional plans. Do you want to continue teaching at your current school? Those are the green dots. Do you want to continue teaching in the division but leave the school? Continue teaching but leave this division? Pursue a non-teaching position, or just leave teaching altogether or retire? And you can see the distribution at the same 3 schools. So you can see, for example, at the high morale school, most all of the teachers want to continue teaching at the current school, and some are looking to pursue non-teaching positions. Where when you look at the low morale school, very few are interested in continuing to teach at that school. A lot of them are looking to move to another school. And then you have some that are interested in getting out of the division, and some that are just going to leave teaching altogether. So it's a very dramatically different sort of portrait of how morale affects the teacher workforce. And so again, it prompts the respondents in the module to reflect why it's important to maintain a high morale workforce, because you can imagine teaching at these 2 different schools and having dramatically different experiences as a school leader. So, we pose these questions. There'll be interactive boxes on these modules. And then we also propose an extension activity. Administer a short survey to a group of teachers at your school to learn about their morale and the factors that influence it. And along with this, we would give them some example questions. And then this could be sort of like an action research project that they do within the context of the school before they go into the second module. What we're doing now, just to kind of explain where this project is we're planning to pilot this fall and winter. I've been meeting with the professional learning departments of a couple of school divisions who have potential pilot groups. And the idea would be to try to get to like 10, 20, maybe 30 people to take these modules. And then we would collect the data that they submitted through the forms, look at it, and then also conduct interviews with them, those that volunteered to be interviewed, to learn about their sort of experience of these modules and how it might have had them think about their practice. We're going to be doing that this fall and winter, and then hopefully redesigning the modules based on that, and then posting them on the MERC website for school divisions to use, and leadership tracks, like any aspiring leader program could do this. It could be sent out to principal cohorts, things like that. And this idea of like using PD modules for research dissemination is something that we're piloting with the teacher retention study, but that we'd like to kind of use as kind of an ongoing platform for research dissemination with our other studies as well. So, all right, I'm going to pass it off to John to talk us through this discussion. Although we're short on time, aren't we?
Yeah, I got about 5 minutes.
Okay.
All right. So in the next 5 minutes, just sort of browse these. These are sort of prompts, but as I said earlier, it's like, think of ourselves. This is a research conference. So what if we think of ourselves as researchers? And you heard short presentations about various aspects of this comprehensive teacher retention study. So what are some common themes that people are seeing and hearing across the different aspects of the study? If you were to sort of go home today and talk to your friends and family and neighbors about, what did I learn in that session about teacher retention? What would you say? And feel free to put those in the chat. And any of the panelists want to weigh in, feel free to unmute your mics and offer some ideas.
You could do a full day conference just on this. I mean, you really could. I'm not kidding at all. I think for me personally, having been a principal, now overseeing human resources, done my graduate work in public policy, I could go on for hours on this, but y'all did a great job of putting all those pieces together.
Yeah, to that point, Andy, we're going to be hosting a symposium in the spring, which should be like a 2 or 3 hour kind of like reflection on teacher retention, and we'll have a lot of the reports that pieces that were presented here finished and longer discussions of them. Yeah, we'll be advertising that soon. We definitely are interested in engaging in more regional conversations about it.
I think one of the things that I've learned over the course of doing all this work is the importance of intentionality around this stuff. I know, Adria has talked about that a lot, and being really, how can divisions be really strategic and coherent and intentional about teacher retention, and maybe taking some of those small P practices and codifying them as policy.
Mm-hmm.
And Adria is a great resource for it. As we know in Goochland, when she was at UVA, she helped us recruit a few teachers there with some creative programming. So great resource.
Happy to support all of our friends in the school divisions. And also, just to build off of what John just said, the intentionality in codifying those small P practices. One of the things that was perhaps not so surprising is when we're thinking about teacher retention policies at central levels in a pretty narrow fashion, and not intentionally narrowly, but just there's so many other things that happen that we say, well, that's not teacher retention policy, that's social emotional learning policy for students, or that's, whatever bucket it falls in. What tends to happen then is there's less documentation overall about those small P practices, which means when we're looking at principals whose tenure averages 5 years, then we lose the institutional knowledge that existed in each building. And then when you look at the average tenure of most superintendents, which is also not very long, or the average tenure of whomever is in a central office overseeing recruitment, overseeing onboarding, overseeing professional learning, which is where we see these, that teacher induction piece occurring, those 3 spaces. When they turn over, then there's a lack of institutional knowledge again, and without the documentation. So the next folks coming in are like, we're not sure what was tried before, because it wasn't necessarily thought of as strategic teacher retention policy. So it's an interesting dilemma, trying to figure out, are we conflating things, or are we intentionally looking for the unintended positive outcomes on teacher retention from other policy work that we're doing?
I have a question, and maybe this is directed to Andy, because you are working in a district as overseeing HR and thinking about maintaining a strong workforce in Goochland. What's your read on the current moment, and what can we do right here, right now to address the situation? What are you all thinking?
I think responsiveness is really important right now, because things have evolved in such a unique manner across several dimensions. Mrs. Horn made a comment in the chat earlier just about the overlaying the political part of all of this now. But we're seeing, I give a state of the workforce presentation every year. I gave it a couple of weeks ago at our board meeting. And I wonder too, how transparent are divisions about their trends in teacher retention, just with their own personnel. One thing that really stuck out to me this year versus last year was that we had 0 people leave Goochland in 2020 to leave the profession. We had 5, and in a small division, 5 left the profession completely in 2021, which is, when you can kind of keep track of that. We're doing in-person exit interviews more now, That really gave us some more rich data, but I know that's a hard thing to pull off in a huge division. We can do that. I think just being responsive and, you know, keeping a good finger on the pulse of your staff. We're trying to do more morale building activities. We have a movie night for our employees this Sunday at the Gooch and Drive-In Theater that we're paying for. You know, they get to come in a little bit late on Monday for conferences. We did a tailgate before a football game, just little things like that. Trying to stay competitive with pay. I could go one and one. I realize we're out of time, but yeah, those are some things that we're doing.
Multifaceted. All right, I think we're over time now, and that was great. Thank you all for coming. Look at all this chat going on, and I didn't see any of it.
Go get some lunch, Jesse. You haven't eaten all day.
I know. Surviving on seltzer.
All right.
All right. Thank you all for coming, and enjoy the rest of the conference, and have a great weekend.
Good job, everybody.
Bye.